Resuming debate, the honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's an honour to rise and represent my constituents of Foothills on this important discussion today on the fall economic statement. Now, what we've heard from the government since this statement was released, and we've certainly heard it in many of the speeches over the last few days, is the Liberals are bragging about being fiscally responsible and fiscal discipline when it comes to this statement. I don't know too many Canadian families or Canadian businesses, for that matter, who would describe fiscal responsibility and fiscal discipline in a time of economic crisis to be increasing spending and going further and further into debt as the right definition of fiscal discipline. Canadians, families across the country are struggling to heat their homes, struggling to feed their families, struggling to operate their businesses and their farms. And the Liberals' response to that is to continue inflationary spending at a record pace. We have seen inflation at a 40-year high, where many Canadians are having to make difficult choices when it comes to their food choices at the dinner table, certainly in their everyday lives. And when the Liberal government talks about making difficult choices, I don't think they really understand what the average Canadian is having to endure when it comes to those difficult choices. A difficult choice for an average Canadian family isn't the difference between cancelling your Disney subscription or having a decision to make on which $7,000 a room night I stay in when I'm in London. The difficult choices Canadian families are having to make right now are, am I going to be able to put my child in sports? Am I going to be able to pay the grocery bill this month? What sacrifices am I going to have to put into my family budget so I can afford to pay my mortgage this month and not lose my home? It just shows you the contrast, Madam Speaker, on how out of touch this government is when they talk about difficult choices being, well, we're only adding up to $40 billion in new spending to add to the $200 billion in additional debt that had nothing to do with COVID, in comparison to the tragic choices Canadians are having to make every single day just to try and get by. I found it, like I would hope many colleagues in this House, found it quite tragic when I heard 1.5 million Canadians had to rely on a food bank in the month of March alone. A 35% increase over that same month prior to COVID. A record number of Canadians relying on a food bank. Those are the difficult choices Canadians are having to make. So when the Liberal government says we are practicing fiscal responsibility and fiscal discipline by adding record debt to further spur record inflation and higher interest rates, those are having real consequences on real Canadians. For example, I'm now hearing from farmers across the country, because of these higher interest rates, are unable to manage the debt on their farms, which is already at a record high. And these interest rates are making that situation much, much worse. And certainly I've heard from constituents who are saying, well, now my mortgage has gone up $500 a month. That is crippling. Now, I know my colleague, who I do respect from Kings Hants, had mentioned his conversation with his constituent who said her rent is now at $1,500 a month, and he's hopeful that she'll get the $500 rent relief. Well, more than 60% of Canadians won't actually qualify for that rent relief program. And I would ask my colleague, if she does qualify for that $500 a month rent relief, one-time check, what is she going to do in January, February, March, April, when she's no longer getting that government check? They need long-term solutions, not a little Band-Aid for what is a hemorrhaging of their financial futures. And as a result of this, the Liberals have not been able to offer the most basic services despite these massive increases in spending. Canadians aren't seeing any bang for their buck as we see an inability to get passports, a $2.4 million backlog in immigration applications. Certainly we've seen the Veterans Affairs Minister under fire for the backlog in veterans benefits. Zero infrastructure projects completed from the Infrastructure Bank. All of these things are having an impact on Canadians who don't see the benefit of these increases in spending. But I want to get back to the impact that this is having on the average Canadian. And I do want to certainly talk about Canadian agriculture as well. When we talk about food being at a 40-year high inflation and the impact this is having on Canadians' everyday ability to buy groceries and put healthy food on the table, which is frustrating considering, Canada is one of those countries where we export 80% of what we produce when it comes to food, and we are seeing these record high prices. When the cost of bread is up 17%, flour 24%, a head of lettuce 21%, potatoes 17%, and pasta up 30%. These are not, as I've said before, these are not, luxury items that you would get at a Liberal cocktail party. These are the staples that Canadians rely on every single day to feed their families, and they're no longer able to afford those critical staples as a result of inflationary spending, but certainly a tripling of the carbon tax, a fertilizer tariff that are increasing and driving up the price of food because it impacts every aspect of the supply chain. Now, those prices are difficult to swallow, certainly, but because of Liberal policy, they're going to get worse. In the fall economic study, in the fall economic statement, it didn't say anything about listening to Conservatives and putting a cap on tax increases. The Liberals are moving ahead with tripling the carbon tax. That is only going to further drive up the cost of food. And the Liberals' undemocratic escalator tax is going to increase the tax on beer, wine, and spirits by 30%. When the Liberals put in the escalator tax, they index it to inflation. Now, why this tax is undemocratic is it doesn't come back to the House of Commons for debate. It automatically goes up every single year. But when the Liberals put in the escalator tax, inflation was around 2%. They felt industry would be able to absorb that. But again, no one foresaw what was going to happen this fall when inflation was in excess of 10%. So now, as a result of that, the escalator tax is going up more than 6%. That is significantly higher what the industry was able to absorb year after year. When our restaurant industry and hotel industry is struggling as a result of coming out of COVID, now this puts a further burden on cost. This is going to severely impact our wine and beer industry, certainly our craft brewers, who bring incredible rural economic development to our rural communities, but certainly also to our farmers who grow the barley and the grapes for those products. This is going to impact them as well. This is a 30% increase on their costs they're going to have to pass on to the consumer. This is an undemocratic tax that is now going to further cripple our agriculture industry and certainly have a massive impact on Canadians and consumers alike. But the huge part of this, and what we asked the Liberals to do in the fall economic statement, was no new taxes. And we were facing a financial economic crisis. For them to continue to pursue tripling of the carbon tax is nonsensical, especially when food security is probably the #1 issue that we're facing not only here in Canada but around the world, when we need our agriculture sector firing on all cylinders to be able to reach its full potential, to meet the needs not only here in Canada but around the world. To be further putting these burdens on Canadian farmers makes zero sense. We already know that the carbon tax costs the average farmer about $45,000 a year. I have one bill here from a farm family in St. Thomas, Ontario. Their propane bill in 1 month, the carbon tax was more than $11,000. Wow. 1 month, $11,000. Now, thanks to the opposition, the Conservatives, with the support of the NDP and the Bloc, with Bill C-234, we've got that through committee, which will be a carbon tax exemption of propane and natural gas. Farmers will get some relief. And we need that bill to go through. And just lastly, Madam Speaker, I want to add this to the conclusion of my speech. We desperately needed the Liberals to put resources aside to establish a vaccine bank here in Canada for Canadian agriculture. The United States says we will no longer be allowed to rely on them for vaccines for livestock. We've seen the impact the avian flu has had on the Canadian agriculture economy. Foot and mouth, African swine fever. These are more than a $45 billion impact on our industries if we do not have the resources in place in Canada to try to address that. We're asking for $4 million to establish that vaccine bank. That was not in the economic fall statement, which I know every stakeholder has pushed the government to do. These are critical resources we need to protect our food supply, food sovereignty, and certainly our agriculture industry in Canada.
Questions and comments? The Honourable